Samuel de Champlain was born around 1574 in the small port town of Brouage on the western coast of France. The exact date of his birth remains uncertain, but historians generally agree it was in the mid-1570s, during a time when France was torn by wars of religion and animated by dreams of overseas expansion. Brouage was no ordinary village. It was a fortified harbor, one of the most active salt-exporting towns in Europe, a place where ships from Spain, Portugal, and England docked regularly. The salty air, the sight of tall masts, and the constant comings and goings of sailors must have imprinted themselves on the boy's imagination from the very start. His father, Antoine Champlain, was a ship's captain, and his uncle was also a skilled mariner. The sea ran in the family's blood, and young Samuel grew up surrounded by stories of navigation, commerce, and adventure. By the time he was old enough to handle a small boat, Champlain had already been trained in the arts of seamanship, steering, reading the tides, handling sails, and orienting by the stars. The harbor of Brouage was his school, the horizon his textbook, and the ocean his inevitable destiny. The France into which Champlain was born was marked by violence and uncertainty. The wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants raged across the country, tearing families apart and leaving entire regions in ashes. Brouage itself was caught in the middle, first Catholic, then Protestant, then Catholic again as power shifted. Champlain grew up in this climate of conflict, learning early on the necessity of negotiation, adaptability, and alliances, skills that would later define his dealings with indigenous peoples in North America. Despite the turmoil, Champlain received a solid education. He learned not only navigation and cartography, but also drawing and writing, skills that would serve him as he carefully recorded his explorations. His early exposure to conflict also seems to have shaped his pragmatic outlook. He sought peace when possible, but he was never afraid to use force when required. As a young man in his 20s, Champlain took part in France's wars, serving under King Henry IV. He learned discipline, tactics, and the harsh realities of military life. These experiences hardened him, but also gave him an appreciation for structure and strategy. Yet his true passion remained the sea. In 1598, his chance arrived when he joined a fleet bound for Spain, serving under his uncle. Spain at the time was the dominant naval power, and French sailors often worked in Spanish service. Champlain soon found himself involved in a major expedition to the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. He traveled to Puerto Rico, Panama, and Mexico, witnessing firsthand the wealth pouring into Europe from the Americas. What impressed Champlain most during these travels was the possibility of a canal across Panama that could link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. He envisioned this bold project centuries before the Panama Canal was actually built. His sharp eye for geography and his boundless curiosity earned him recognition as a man of vision and practical intelligence. By the early 1600s, France was eager to establish its own colonies in the Americas, competing with Spain and England. Champlain, with his background as a navigator and his growing reputation as a cartographer, was the perfect candidate to lead explorations. In 1603, Champlain made his first recorded voyage to North America, traveling up the St. Lawrence River. He carefully studied the terrain, drew maps, and recorded details about the indigenous peoples he met. Unlike many European explorers, Champlain displayed genuine interest in understanding indigenous cultures. He noted their social structures, languages, and ways of life, trying to make sense of a world vastly different from his own. 2 years later, in 1605, Champlain helped establish Port Royal in Acadia, in present-day Nova Scotia. This was one of France's earliest attempts at a permanent settlement in the New World. Life in Port Royal was not easy. Winters were brutal, supplies were scarce, and relations with indigenous groups required delicate handling. Champlain, however, distinguished himself by his leadership and optimism. He organized the settlement, encouraged agriculture, and even created a social club called the Order of Good Cheer, where colonists would take turns preparing meals to lift spirits and maintain morale through the harsh winter months. Though Port Royal was eventually abandoned, it set the stage for Champlain's greatest achievement, the founding of Quebec. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain sailed up the St. Lawrence River once more, this time with a clear mission: to establish a permanent French settlement. He chose a narrow point in the river where the cliffs offered natural defense and where trade routes with indigenous nations converged. There, he laid the foundations of a small habitation that would grow into the city of Quebec, the heart of French Canada. The first winter was catastrophic. Harsh cold, lack of proper shelter, and outbreaks of scurvy claimed the lives of many settlers. Of the 28 men who stayed that first winter, only 8 survived. Champlain himself nearly died, but he persisted, determined not to let the dream of New France perish. His resilience in the face of hardship became one of his defining traits. Champlain understood that survival in North America required cooperation with indigenous peoples. He forged alliances with the Huron and Algonquin nations, offering them military support in their conflicts against the Iroquois. In 1609, he joined his allies in battle near what is now Lake Champlain, using European firearms against the Iroquois. The alliance brought the French trade opportunities and security, but it also entrenched hostilities that would shape the region's conflicts for centuries. Despite the violence, Champlain consistently emphasized diplomacy and respect. He learned indigenous languages, traveled into their territories, and sought to understand their customs. He envisioned a colony where French settlers and indigenous peoples could live in cooperation, bound together by trade, religion, and mutual defense. One of Champlain's greatest talents was his skill as a cartographer. Over the years, he produced remarkably detailed maps of the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and large portions of eastern North America. His maps were so accurate that they remained useful for decades, guiding explorers, traders, and settlers. Champlain's explorations took him deep into the continent. He traveled as far west as the Great Lakes, documenting lands and peoples unknown to most Europeans. His curiosity drove him to see beyond the immediate needs of trade and colonization, always imagining the broader geography of the land. Champlain's work in New France was constantly threatened by rivalries back in Europe. Colonization was expensive, and France's kings were often preoccupied with wars at home. Funding was scarce, and Champlain had to continually persuade investors and royal officials to support the colony. At times, control of Quebec shifted between different trading companies, and Champlain was forced to defend his vision against rivals who cared only for profit. In 1628, disaster struck when English privateers, led by David Kirke, captured Quebec. Champlain and the settlers were forced to surrender, and for 3 years, New France remained under English control. Champlain was taken back to Europe, where he lobbied tirelessly for the return of the colony. In 1632, with the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, France regained Quebec, and Champlain returned once more to rebuild. By the 1630s, Champlain was widely recognized as the father of New France. His tireless dedication had transformed a fragile settlement into the foundation of a French presence in North America. Though he never saw the colony grow into the thriving society he dreamed of, his groundwork ensured its survival. In his later years, Champlain continued to govern Quebec, oversee its defenses, and promote agriculture and trade. He encouraged missionaries to work among indigenous peoples, hoping to spread Christianity and strengthen alliances. Though sometimes paternalistic in his views, Champlain genuinely believed in cooperation between cultures, a rare perspective in his age. Samuel de Champlain died on December 25, 1635, in Quebec, at around 61 years of age. His death was mourned deeply by the settlers, who saw in him the guiding force of their survival. He was buried in Quebec, the city he had founded, far from his birthplace in France, but at the heart of the land he had dedicated his life to building. His legacy lived on. Quebec grew into the stronghold of French Canada, and Champlain's vision of a colony rooted in both European and indigenous alliances shaped the destiny of a continent. Though he faced failures, defeats, and countless hardships, Champlain's resilience and determination carved out a lasting place in history. Facts about Samuel de Champlain. Champlain's exact birth date is unknown, but historians place it around 1574. He first traveled to the Americas with the Spanish before exploring for France. He was fascinated by the idea of a canal across Panama, centuries before it became reality. Champlain founded Quebec in 1608, which is now one of the oldest cities in North America. He named Lake Champlain after himself during his 1609 expedition. He established the Order of Good Cheer, one of the first social clubs in North America. Champlain created some of the most accurate maps of 17th century North America. He forged alliances with the Huron and Algonquin peoples, shaping regional politics for generations. Champlain never had biological children, though he married Hélène Boulet, who was just 12 years old at the time of their marriage contract. He's often called the Father of New France, a title reflecting his central role in establishing French Canada. Samuel de Champlain's story is one of vision, resilience, and relentless pursuit of a dream. Born in a small French harbor town, he crossed oceans, mapped rivers, battled winters, and built bridges between cultures. He faced defeat and returned. He saw his colony nearly perish, yet he refused to let it die. Champlain's legacy is not only in the maps he drew or the cities he founded. It lives in the spirit of determination that shaped the history of Canada. His life reminds us that exploration is not only about discovery, but about endurance. Champlain showed that progress often comes through patience, courage, and the belief that what begins small, like a handful of settlers by a river, can grow into something enduring. From the salty breezes of Brouage to the icy winters of Quebec, Champlain's journey continues to inspire, a testament to the power of vision, persistence, and the human will to create a future against all odds.